Hello, everyone, once again to the Climate Finance Academy in this session on financing just transition. My name is Gennaro Godoy. I'm one of the contact points of the Finance and Markets Working Group. And yeah, it's great to have you here again, once again. We are stepping forward in about half of our program now, so we're happy um, that moving forward and remembering the housekeeping rules. So please keep your microphones muted. Turn on your cameras as much as possible. And if you have any questions, you can write them in the chat. There's there's supposed to be a Q&A also button in the chat. And if you like someone's question, you put your favorite emoji so we know and we take it into consideration. And we're gonna be sharing the attendance form at midpoint of the session, so be aware as well. But don't worry that you will have enough time um, to fill it out. You don't have to fill it out just and if you miss some of these sessions, you can always rewatch them on YouTube within a couple of days and fill up the form. So thank you, everyone. And now I'm going to introduce our first speaker for today, which is Giben Wang, which is expert and youth leader. As a global coordinator for the Children and Youth Major Group of the United Nations Environment Program. It's a constituency, as we explained in the beginning of the academy, that engages with the environmental agreements around the the the, the environmental assembly. So, without further ado, Given, the floor is yours, and you can maybe introduce yourself first, and how do you come up to have the different roles that you're having right now, and we can talk a little bit about the energy just transition landscape and so on.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Jen. As Jen mentioned, I'm Global Coordinator of CIMG, and we're a sister constituency to Younger. In my professional life, I work in the energy sector, and if you look through my LinkedIn profile, you'll see, like my experience, that I've worked in energy, minerals, and the financial and economic dimensions of it. So I work in analyzing the global state of the energy transition and its implications for the global economy. So I'm going to be discussing a little bit the background behind the just transition and the energy dimension of it. If you have any questions at any point, just stop me and I'll be happy to pause and discuss things in a bit more detail. Okay, there we go. Can you see that okay?
Yeah, we can see it now.
Yep, perfect. So starting with a bit of background about why the energy transition matters. Of course, energy accounts for 3/4 of global emissions, and as such, reducing emissions in the energy sector is key to achieving the goals set out by the Paris Agreement of limiting climate change to well under 2 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial levels. And how have we done on that so far? Well, emissions growth at the moment is the slowest since the Great Depression in the 1920s. But as we are probably all aware, emissions in absolute terms are still growing, just at a slower rate. So the total amount of emissions is still increasing, and that's not particularly helpful. But what we have seen is that despite an expanding global economy across emerging markets as well as advanced economies, we are still seeing that global emissions growth is slowing. That's due to a number of factors, which include more efficient economic activity, which depends less on energy inputs than services and advanced industrial manufacturing. And also the rise of clean energy as the primary source of electricity generation is playing a huge role in ensuring that our emissions growth is slowing despite increasing economic activity. In 2023, the emissions in advanced economies are back to the 1973 level. So that is 50 years ago, at the onset of the oil crisis, despite having a global economy that is 3 times larger than it was 50 years ago. And of course, as you have all seen in news media, global clean energy deployment is reaching new heights year on year. Solar PV notably is growing, it's almost doubling every year, with deployments of over 400 gigawatts in 2023 and expected to reach 600 gigawatts or more in 2024. Wind as well, growing very rapidly despite some setbacks in the global wind industry, and of course electric vehicles in much of the advanced economies in China. And in 2025, solar PV generation is expected to exceed generation from coal and nuclear power plants. And of course, these momentums are expected to continue through 2024 and beyond, despite macroeconomic headwinds that are sort of dampening global enthusiasm for the energy transition. And onto the just transition side of things, we will talk a little bit about employment because that is really the key part of the just side of the just energy transition. What we have seen is that clean energy is really driving the rebound in energy employment, following on from the COVID-19 and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So fossil fuel employment has remained stable and is still not back to its pre-pandemic levels. But on the other hand, clean energy employment is at record highs and is expected to scale the heights every single year. This is a result of a few things that are working together in tandem. Of course, energy investments are growing significantly in clean energy, and the overall picture for the energy industry is quite healthy overall. And more people work now in the energy sector globally than in 2019, and this totals nearly 67 million jobs in 2022. And of course, as you can see from the chart here, that is almost exclusively due to clean energy job growth, and despite fossil fuel employment remaining at a fairly steady rate and expected to plateau in the coming years or even decline depending on which scenario you're looking at. Out of these clean energy jobs, solar PV, wind, electric vehicles, batteries, heat pumps, and critical minerals mining account for more than half of the job growth over this period. So that is more than 3 million jobs over the past 3 or 4 years. And these 5 sectors employ around 7 million people today. And of course, this is not just localized to one specific country. These jobs have been distributed across all regions of the world. China in particular has had an unprecedented shift towards clean energy, and alongside it, we have had a shift in employment towards clean energy sectors. And China alone employs close to 1/3 of the global energy workforce, of which about 60% is in clean energy, amounting to about 3 million workers overall. Of course, having people means that you have things to build and deploy. And of course, as we have seen, clean energy manufacturing is at record highs every year. Driven by supportive policies and the increasing importance of these clean energy industries, manufacturing capacities are booming, even though it remains uneven across regions and technologies. So the announced projects are scaling up very, very rapidly, especially for solar PV and batteries. And although wind and heat pumps are somewhat behind, these industries are still developing rapidly and are expected to account for a significant portion of global energy employment in the coming years. When it comes to hydrogen electrolyzers, these are facing fairly significant headwinds and are not expected to be perhaps as important at the energy systems level than they were just a few years ago, but still the employment potential in these sectors is not to be understated. So when we think about just transitions, I think very often about coal mining regions. This includes areas like South Africa, Indonesia, parts of North Rhine-Westphalia in Germany, and of course, Poland. These areas are at particular risk during the energy transition due to a number of reasons, which include mechanization, productivity gains, and of course, looking into the future, we're looking at a decline in coal production in absolute terms as well. Between 2019 and 2022, the coal mining workforces shrank globally by about 225,000, but still remained at a high level of 6.2 million. Over time, in the IEA's stated policy scenario, coal employment declines by a further 1.5 million to 2030, and that has significant implications for communities in these regions. Of course, each worker is not responsible just for themselves, but also for their communities and households. So the total impact is probably about 4 to 5 times larger than the absolute workforce reduction over this time period. The IEA has a coal transitions exposure index, which account for 95% of global coal production and employment. The majority of these countries have established net zero emissions targets, and around half of these countries have targets to reduce or phase out coal. However, far fewer than this proportion have implemented, announced, or initiated discussions on just transitions for the coal sector employed workers. Indeed, as you can see from the chart on the screen here, in 2022, just transition policies covered only 4% of coal mining workers worldwide. But just in 2023, this increased quite rapidly, 15%, reflecting significant and accelerated progress. At the same time, it is abundantly clear that we have an urgent need for countries to consider how best to help workers and communities in coal mining areas, especially when it comes to replacing the economic activity associated with coal mining. And of course, concerns over these labor shortages have to be addressed to avoid slowing down the pace of the energy transition. And this, in many cases, requires people-centered support and training for fossil fuel workers. Many of the skills that are in high demand across clean energy sectors are already present within the fossil fuel industries. And this includes manufacturing, mining, and heating or deployment. And many of these workers are likely to face redundancy risks as the world continues transitioning towards clean energy technologies. More than half of these workers have skills that are required in rapidly expanding sectors. And as a result, we assess that there is a significant potential for these workers to transfer to other industries with retraining as necessary. And indeed, 36% of the energy workforce are high-skilled workers requiring some form of tertiary education. And this compares to 27% across the whole economy. So energy workers are often highly trained and highly educated. And a further 50% are medium skilled, requiring some level of vocational training. And as shown by LinkedIn's recent report on climate jobs across the world, the number of workers pursuing certifications in the energy sector is not keeping up with growing demand for labor in these segments. Across major economies, degrees relevant to energy have flattened over the past decade, despite jobs requiring these skills increasing by 8% per year to 2030 in our net zero scenario. Similarly, we see patterns in medium skilled positions where vocational training pipelines have not been growing proportionally to labor demand. And of course, as seen from the previous sector, retraining vocational workers has a significant potential to alleviate the concerns that are posed by coal mining communities and manufacturing regions as the energy transition progresses. Of course, part of the issue here is that we have a significant concentration of global clean energy supply chains that includes not just critical minerals, but also production of key energy technologies such as solar panels. This means that the largest impact of the clean energy transition for workers is likely to be concentrated in a few regions, and that is in spite of the global nature of the energy transition. Another dimension of the just transition is that of clean cooking in Africa, where 80% of the population does not have access to clean cooking technologies. And this is in spite of the fact that since 2010, the population without access to clean cooking technologies fell by nearly 1 billion, thanks to policies in South and Eastern Asia. But this population continues to grow in sub-Saharan Africa due to inadequate policy support. I'll stop my presentation here, and I'm happy to take any questions as necessary. Thanks, Jen.
Thanks, Cuban. That was quite insightful. A lot of data that will be very useful for our colleagues, especially when they'll be making their position papers on the Rota COP. We have a question, a hand raised by Peter Bumilo. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes, definitely. Thank you very much, Glenn and Jibin. Obviously, we have interacted on the UNEP side of things, and it's so nice to see you here as well. The conversation on just transition is one that is very close to my heart, so I have been following closely, and I have a couple of questions, some areas of contention that I'd really love to get some clarification. You talked about a number of countries that are implementing just transition policies. Do we, for example, have a list of some of those countries, and do we have any best practices that we can borrow from them? That is number one. Number two, for the 1.5 million who might be jobless from the coal employment by 2030, do we have any policies in place to ensure that they are for, or they're covered, upskilling, reskilling, and the jobs transition, of course, in line with the International Labour Organization's policies on just transition. And then finally, what happens to the unexploited resources? I know, for example, in South Africa, in Nigeria, we have large deposits of unexploited resources. Who pays for the cost of unexploitation? Because the developed countries, they used these natural resources to develop themselves. And then there are some of these countries that have untapped reserves, but they're told not to explore. So what happens to them? Maybe you can take those first.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. A couple of really interesting questions. On the first, when it comes to the just transition and implications for workers in coal mining regions, that depends on the capacity of the individual countries to implement these policies. So, of course, when you look at countries like Germany, where the traditional coal mining regions, they have been phasing out coal production to quite a large extent over the past, couple of decades. There have been structural policies implemented by the local and federal governments to provide reskilling opportunities for these workers, as well as very significant support for unemployment. So in many cases, these insurance policies amount to pay out up to 60 to 80% of the actual wages they're receiving before they were laid off. And that gives them a bit of time to transition between different jobs, and of course, with targeted support for reskilling and vocational training systems during this period as well. I think part of the issue at hand is not just that these are jobs, that these are very highly paid, often well-protected jobs. So these workers often belong to unions who negotiate for high wages. And the concern is that when they reskill and get a different job, the quality of the employment would not be as high, and the value to the economy would not be as high either. So a key part of this is ensuring that you're able to replace the livelihoods that are provided by these secure and well-paid union mining jobs. And that is a concern for many countries and many regions, including in places, historical places like Korea as well, and also in states in the US like West Virginia. So at the same time, of course, South Africa and Indonesia have not had the financial capacity of Germany to provide such structural support for these transitioning industries. And many of these cases, the governments feel as though they are locked into a pathway where they can't risk shutting these mines without angering significant demographics who contribute to the economy. On the second question, Peter, of the unexploited natural resources, that I think is much tougher to answer. The Western world, who are advocating for this, are going some way, certainly not enough when it comes to the just energy transition partnerships. So for countries like Indonesia and South Africa, with huge coal reserves and traditional reliance on coal power generation, there are incentives in place to mothball existing coal plants and replace them with renewable energy. But the scale of support and the timelines are certainly a bit too delayed to be to make a meaningful dent in the short term for many of these communities. So I'll leave it at that, I think.
Thank you so much. I hope that clarifies the question, Peter. Amin has a question on the chat. I don't know if you want to raise your hand. We still have a couple minutes for Q&A. If not,
Sure.
yeah, thank you.
Happy to. Thank you. Yeah, really great presentation. My question is just on sort of your final slide on like clean cooking in Africa. As you mentioned, in East Asia, there was quite a few policies that were successful in increasing the adoption of clean cooking. LPG is seen as an alternative to the sort of like current practice at the moment, but would obviously require significant investments in that. What would you say would be like policies that countries in Africa could adopt in order to, have a rapid, I guess, adoption of clean cooking? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, very interesting question. When it comes to LPG, there is the concern that you are locking in sub-Saharan Africa communities into a path of technology dependence, which is not particularly helpful. And if you look at the IEA's Clean Cooking Summit, which was held in Paris a few months ago, many of these companies were fossil fuel companies like Total, Vitol, who promoted LPG as a clean cooking solution. And yes, in many cases, like some of the bigger cities in Africa, there's maybe a solution because you have the infrastructure and the personnel to provide energy infrastructure, so gas transport infrastructure. This typically in Africa means not pipelines, but literal trucks full of canisters of gas. But this is not a scalable solution for most communities in sub-Saharan Africa. And the poorest communities will probably be best served using solar cook stoves, which are zero emission and provide, and have the opportunity to couple with batteries and solar panels, which are far more modular and more scalable when it comes to rolling out to rural unconnected communities. So I think, personal opinion, but most places in Africa should not be investing or locking into fossil fuel dependent pathways, including LPG, and should instead be looking towards electrification as the first port of call for the energy transition for communities.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Gibbon, for those insightful answers. We are limited in time for the next question, but Gugulitho, if you can leave it on the chat, maybe Gibbon, if you want, you can also maybe answer it, and we can come back for a Q&A after our next speaker as well. If there's maybe an interesting conversation that can happen between Gibbon and Lily. So I will introduce our next speaker. One second. All right. So yeah, we're happy to have Lily Birch here with us. Maybe could you connect your camera so I can... Okay, great.
I have.
Thank you so much. So Lily Birch, whoops, there it is. My computer is like going crazy right now. But we're happy to have Lily Birch here, which is a climate finance expert focusing on climate bonds. And she essentially works as a senior policy analyst for the Climate Bonds Initiative, developing reports on how governments, central banks, and other policymakers can implement sustainable finance policies that can help us achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, specifically on temperature goal, 1.5 degrees, and also leads a fossil gas and hydrogen transition policy work stream, and has been a contributing author of the Working Group 2 for the IPCC 6 assessment report, and holds bachelor degrees in geography, and it's a level 4 certified climate investment at the CFA of UK. We're super happy to have you here, Lily, especially because we have been talking and already introducing kind of what could be certain policies surrounding the alignment of financial flows towards low carbon and climate resilient development. And as now that we are talking about the just transition, it's ever more relevant how these policies as well can affect the availability of work of workers and so on, and other co-benefits that this could have. So we were super interested about your work specifically and what you can tell us, considering as well that this amazing cohort is also very diverse, but everyone is kind of like aiming at becoming climate finance practitioners. So we also have like a level of technical knowledge about these. So we're very happy to have you here, Lily. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So if you'd share my slides, I'll quickly sort of explain Climate Bonds Initiative. We're a global NGO focused on mobilizing global capital markets for climate action. So we developed the first green taxonomy and have been influential in development of most climate taxonomies around the world. And in my side, we focus on policy, looking at how sustainable finance policies can help unlock private capital specifically to move towards green. And sorry, do you want me to share my slides, or would you?
I'm trying to, just that it's loading my computer right now. It's like
no worries,
collapsing, but
that's absolutely fine. I'm happy to go on.
Yeah, you can introduce yourself first, so we can
Yeah, don't worry.
there.
So I've sort of drawn this presentation of the 101 Sustainable Finance Policies for 1.5 degrees C, which is a sort of flagship policy paper we produced last year. And sorry, yeah, as you can see, all the slides. And we wrote this paper in order to help incentivize and encourage rapid action from policymakers across the world. And when talking about policymakers, we're sort of covering central government, national, subnational governments, central banks, development banks, and the sort of the whole range, not just governments. And so we go to the next slide quickly, please. So I think, as we're probably all aware of the sort of need for rapid transition, in the last IPCC report showed a rapidly closing window to meet 1.5, and without rapid action, we'll see increasing social and economic costs and increasing cost of capital, increasing cost of investment, which will make decarbonisation effectively that much more difficult. And so sort of rapid transition has been modelled by sort of NGFS and others to be cheaper in the long run than a slow or disorderly transition, and can help deliver growth and sustainable development. And so next slide, please. However, our climate investment gap that we face is far greater than public finance capabilities. So we need to bring in private investment. So you need about sort of 6 trillion a year by 2040. And we're currently way below that. And the thing is, private investor demand for climate investment is actually very high. There's most green bonds see substantial oversubscription. There isn't a problem in investor demand. There's a problem of risk appetite. That investor risk appetite tends to be much lower than the projects which need financing. So we need to address both how risks are assessed, because there is a sort of challenges in risk understanding possibly on many of these climate investments, but then we also need to address these risks. Some of these risks are material and financial and will need to be mitigated. So we need to address sort of risk of very nascent technologies, and also often more sort of emerging market investments where there's sort of higher political currency risks, risk and stability risks, various challenges for international investors to participate in them. And if you go to the next slide, please. So our paper touches on 101 policies which provide in which ways that governments can deliver rapid change, looking at the role, as I mentioned, of central government, regulators, central banks, and DFIs and MDBs. And this is something which needs the participation of all of these actors. It can't really be delivered by just one, it can't be delivered just by central government. We need this sort of whole ecosystem to move, and that includes even, all government departments covering areas which probably aren't necessarily thought of as sort of climate transition areas. We need to, if you sort of look at the report, is sort of, you need to cover, health spending needs to be aligned with green, defense spending needs to be aligned. All these elements need to be sort of channeled and aligned with transition. And next slide, please. And so the report sort of categorizes policies into 3 sort of buckets. And first one is a sort of idea of speed. So we need various policies which enable rapid transition, because faster transition, more stable, even if that might sound counterintuitive. And so these are things about really kind of embedding climate action in your development strategies, aligning your development strategy climate targets, developing climate laws, developing a sustainable finance roadmap which looks to align your whole economy, and also lots of the sort of more global collaboration, coordinated action, the UNFCCC process, the IPCC process to some extent, all of these pieces where particularly on the global collaboration, it's a piece where governments can have a sort of outsized impact beyond what they're currently doing. And that's not just, I think, what it can be seen as sort of developed countries sort of telling emerging markets what they need to do, but also emerging markets sort of feeding back to governments, particularly on the risk, but also on some of the innovations. And what we've seen in lots of these policies, actually, there's lots of sort of innovative examples coming out of more emerging markets, particularly, say, on the central banking side, there's lots of policies which are more sort of emerging market central banks have been sort of more bullish than developed economy ones. And then the sort of steer pillar, which is our sort of probably biggest one. And this is all about sort of trying to alter existing traditional investment models to deliver transition. So we're not trying to rewrite the global economy. We need to sort of try and repurpose it what we need. And so it's about incorporating transition risks and opportunities into investment decisions. And so that's sort of pieces like carbon pricing and requiring companies to disclose their transition plans, encouraging them to start incorporating, assessing and incorporating the climate risks that they're exposed to. And equally sort of central bank actions, looking at applying sort of climate risk weightings to reserve requirements, capital requirements, all these sorts of things. I may be saying lots of terms that you don't know, and to tell me if you can pick me up on any of them, and the report gives a sort of bite-sized explanation of each of these policies. And then part of also this sort of steer pillar is this de-risking piece. And this is sort of can be tricky because we have quite a limited amount of public capital, but we need to apply it in where it's most needed to sort of de-risk investments. And that's the idea where you take your public capital, you make either a little bit of investment in this investment, or you provide a guarantee, or you provide a subsidy on the investment, and that just changes its risk profile enough to enable private sector participation. And there's a massive variety of these. Blended finance, obviously the most famous one, but then there are also kind of other policies which provide a sort of de-risking set of sort of idea. Things like sort of a green trade window where you might provide lower tariffs for green imports, green export finance facilities where you provide, again, sort of preferential terms for green exporters, all these sorts of things. It's not necessarily just sort of direct subsidies, which obviously comes with reasonable significant cost for government to implement. And then our final pillar is simplify, and the sort of main policy underneath this is the taxonomy, which I mentioned earlier. And this is how governments can provide, or governments, central banks, whoever, provide science-based standards on what is green. And so it provides a sort of backbone of sustainable finance policies. It provides sort of common definitions for what is climate aligned, what is a resilient investment and mitigation investment. Also, often they're provided for water or biodiversity. The EU taxonomy covers a sort of wider range of environmental objectives other than just climate ones. And these are really important to then help people know what they're talking about, and also provide a sort of, they're seen as very complicated, which I had a bit of sort of pushback when we put this in our simplify pillar, but in theory they should be able to provide this sort of common language and avoid potentially help avoid greenwashing, help avoid sort of misperceptions of what is green. We saw a couple of years ago a lot of angst over people trying to label natural gas as a green investment or as a transition investment. These sorts of taxonomies, which provide sort of scientific thresholds of what is 1.5 aligned, can help with tackling those sorts of issues. And then another key, sort of close to my heart one under this pillar is green sovereign bond issuance. Obviously, bonds are sort of climate bonds, bread and butter, but sovereign bonds are really important because they are basically where a government issues a normal bond, issues debt to finance their operations, but they label that bond as green and they specify what it is financing, which specific investment, providing investors with sort of confidence that they are investing in something which is green. Or they can be something called a sustainability linked bond, where they are linking the basically the price of their borrowing to certain environmental KPIs, and then they're kind of that gives the investor confidence that they're going to meet said KPIs because the borrower doesn't want to have an increased price of borrowing. And these not only help to align public finance with green, but they also provide a really important signal to the market and help encourage private investors to, private companies to issue green sustainability bonds, sustainable bonds, whatever we call them, themselves. And this is a very important market now. It's the biggest sort of source of labeled sustainable finance out there at the moment. There's USD $5 trillion dollar market out there of green bonds, and so it's a sort of that is the kind of obviously pales into insignificance when we look at investment gaps, but is a very important way to channel finance to the market. Channel finance to projects that need it. Bonds are invested in by sort of big institutional investors who have the levels of capital we need to meet 1.5. And then if we skip to the next slide, please. I'm just going to sort of come back to a few of these sort of de-risking policies, because I think this is the sort of most crucial area, because I said we've got the capital, the capital is available. It's about trying to match investment appetite to projects that need it. And so we have a couple of policy examples. The first one is sovereign guarantees, which is a slightly more innovative one in the green space. We haven't seen them in the green space, but it's a possible option. So basically it's gone the principle of US and other countries have provided guarantees to other sovereigns on their bonds. So they've, basically providing investors with confidence that if the original issuer can't repay the bond, they'll have some level of returns they'll be able to get back from the guarantor. So the US provided one on an Iraqi bond in 2017, and they attached various conditionalities to this bond in terms of what policies the government would implement. And so we could do something similar for green on either on a green sovereign issuance or even on a vanilla, we call them vanilla, like a normal bond from a sovereign, requiring implementation of certain policies or requiring expenditure on certain green investments. And then just wanted to look at the role of development finance institutions, which are very big. They're currently the biggest contributor of climate finance globally. And the problem is obviously they also have limited funds. So they currently, a lot of the climate finance they provide is straight direct investments. They'll invest in 100% of a project with a grant or a loan or a equity investment. However, that's not very efficient use of funds. Lots of the projects they're investing in could be financially viable for a private investor. So blended finance is one way in which they can use their concessional finance to reduce a project's risk and enable private investors to co-invest with them in said project. Lots of challenges with blended finance, which we can get into if people are interested. Basically, they are at the moment, pretty bespoke and slow transactions to develop. So it's very challenging to get to the scale we need from something like this. And then a final sort of one from different actors, sort of central banks. And here is how central banks have a whole host of policies available to them. One such policy is looking at adjusting their capital requirements. So how much capital they require a bank, financial institution to hold to protect themselves from risk. And we've seen from the Hungarian central bank, they provide a nice example of providing sort of preferential capital requirements on green mortgages. And so that was because they saw these green mortgages as posing a lower risk of default compared to normal mortgages. And so they said we can provide, you don't need to hold as much capital against these are less risky instruments. And then that's it. You go to the following slide. And then I think the final point I want to make is all these policies can help move the needle, but we need a massive range of policies in order to actually unlock climate finance. And so there's been a recent study, which has been very welcome, which has found that most effective policies, so where like policies have been introduced and we've actually seen a drop in emissions has been associated with introduction of more than one policy. So we need, as what we, policy makes, we need a sort of whole economy policy roadmap in order to tackle, like I mentioned, these sort of risk perceptions, in order to tackle inertia, in order to tackle technology risk, all these sort of different elements. And then that will help actually unlock, completely shift the economy. Whereas, if you say rely on carbon pricing, which often you see carbon pricing used as a sort of proxy for policies. If you rely on carbon pricing alone, you're not going to sort of overcome this sort of inertia. People absorb that cost, and you won't kind of get the rapid change that we need. And of course, this adds another layer of complexity because all these policies then need sort of prioritization and sequencing, because some of them provide data that you need for implementation of others, which provides added layer of complication for government, which is why we kind of advocate for the
Hey, was it me that I lost my connection? Yeah. All
sorry,
right.
that was, yes, I said, yeah, next slide. If you go to the next slide, you can download the report, and if anyone's got any questions.
This is the final slide, right? All right. Thank you so much, Lily. I hope there are some questions in the chat. I wanted to ask you specifically, because you mentioned that what you found were the most impactful policies on reducing emissions were those that were the biggest one, or kind of like the whole economy approach. And I guess that kind of effort needs a huge collaboration between different ministries and the whole like government to support that. And that brings me on thinking a little bit of what the IPCC report recommends as like the most impactful policies that are needs to be looked through a transformational approach. And I wonder on this regard, and thinking that transformational approach from the IPCC also puts a lot of elements regarding just transition and climate justice. And I wonder where do you think there are the bottlenecks? Of course, general, because every government is different, but where do you think are the bottlenecks to advance on this huge whole of economy approach, transformative policies or set of policies, considering that, well, next year also the IPCC says that we need to reach peak emissions and reduce drastically 43% on the end of the decade. So yeah, happy to
Yeah, I think that's something I didn't really talk about, which is the sort of political economy approach. So I think we saw it really clearly last summer across Europe when we saw the farmer protests, when the European Commission tried to change the agricultural subsidy regime in order to try and tilt it more towards green, to try and reduce subsidies to more damaging agricultural practices. And the kind of resulting protests and disruption ended up with the policy being weakened in terms of this environmental impact. And so I think that's probably one of the biggest bottlenecks, because that means that once you've gotten to all the effort of governments have decided to implement a policy, design it and all that, then it gets rolled back. So it's incorporating that sort of political economy piece, which is the sort of just transition piece. That is where you can ensure impact, ensure sort of stability of your policies, which is also really important. It's a lot of, providing kind of predictability of policies, what investors need. So I say that is one of the most important things, and it's one that we're kind of currently looking at more and more, particularly is how we kind of integrate just transition into financial instruments and how we integrate it into kind of policy mixes.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. There is a question by Kristen. Well, two questions regarding. One first, we were talking last session about venture capital and also what's that role in all the whole mix of instruments that should unlock finance. So I guess in terms of like the regulation that governments can put in place on venture capital, do you have any thoughts on how this could play the role of accelerating this source? And if you have any ideas on the EU and how could we send political messages to the EU to be more ambitious on this COP and accelerate the transition?
Yeah, venture capital is an interesting one. I think it definitely plays a role in terms of providing that kind of early stage financing. It's not one that we focus on very much. Being bonds, we look at the more later stage financing, but I think it can play a role. There can be sort of, governments can, introduce sort of regulations on sort of venture capital to help sort of tilt them to green, just the same way as with banks. I'd say the only kind of cautionary note is often, it's seen as a very like innovative, taking on very high risk, all these sorts of things. And venture capital can actually be not very useful for this sort of early stage development work. It can be too short term, so it's not really willing to hold on to an investment for long enough to see it develop and see it kind of become more sort of financially viable. Yeah, I don't know if anyone's read, Mariana Mazzucato, but it's that sort of the role of the state tends to be much more impactful in terms of scaling up these sorts of innovative technologies than something like venture capital, because venture capital product is sort of too much driven by profit, and the model is a sort of short-term investment, high risk, high profit, and you actually need longer term, lower profit, lower risk to sort of invest in transition.
Yeah, and I guess that was the main issue that you were explaining is how there is need for the risking kind of like guarantees or other sorts of instruments because of the low profit and medium or high risk of some transformational approaches as well, especially when we're talking about adaptation. And yeah, so venture capital could, I guess it plays a huge role, but those technologies that are ready to be deployed and like are much needed to be scalable and well, I guess an energy that also plays a place. I wonder if there's anyone else that has a question or want to jump in the conversation. Xana here, do you want to raise your hand? We'll let Sana ask her question first and then Peter.
Yeah, I can. Okay, can I go?
Yes, sure.
Okay. Hi, Lily. This is Shauna. I'm speaking from Mozambique, and thanks again for your presentation. I wanted to know if you do any work on debt for nature swap. So that's basically when, you know, developing countries' foreign debt is forgiven or they restructure it to exchange for investments in, climate causes or things related to conservation. And you mentioned a bit about just transition when putting in efforts for climate policy. So I just wanted to know, what do you think of that? And maybe just to piggyback on Gennaro's question, what do you think of carbon credits as a way of promoting just transition? Because you mentioned taxonomy, and we have this issue of, integrity of carbon credits or projects saying that they're reducing CO2 and they're actually not doing it. How do you see that moving forward? I think one of the priorities for this COP is locking in Article 6 of the Paris Agreement on, And I just want to hear your thoughts on this, specifically on the relationship between developed countries and developing countries. I think we're very much focused on developed countries approach, but how do you see international cooperation when it comes to climate finance? Thanks.
Sure, that's really interesting. I think, yeah, debt for nature swap's really and sort of growing in attention given the sort of over indebtedness we're seeing in lots of countries and sort of, countries not being able to borrow more in order to fund transition. Debt for nature swaps, I think, will play a really useful role. The only problem is they are very sort of slow and expensive to develop. So while, they can help countries address their debt, they can help, reduce their debt, help increase conservation. But I think they're possibly not necessarily the first policy we should reach to. I think we should, look at for the country that is helping with this debt for nature swap, we need someone to provide sort of concessional financing to fund this debt for nature swap. I think there are possibly other better uses of that concessional financing in terms of sort of value for money and of driving conservation, but they're definitely a really interesting one. And I think we've also seen them with bonds. We saw a blue bond which financed, I hope I don't get this wrong, debt for nature swap in Belize, looking to protect oceans, and that was financed by the World Bank. And so these sort of innovative financial instruments are really important. I think we're just probably not going to see the scale of financing we need from them. And then on carbon credits, tricky. There is a role for carbon credits. I think probably, as you mentioned, Article 6 is the way. I think we need to concentrate on the use of carbon credits as a way to finance conservation rather than on their use for offsetting and all that. It's a sort of, there's a lot of people, I think, getting worried about carbon credits as, enabling oil producers to continue with their, high emissions or whatever. They probably would have done that anyway if the carbon credit wasn't available. I think you need to sort of concentrate on developing high quality carbon credits that deliver conservation and also can deliver just transition. We can integrate indigenous rights protections into those, all that sort of thing. But I think the emphasis should be on getting the carbon credits right rather than necessarily on worrying too much about who's buying them. We can kind of get them, the ones who are buying them in other ways. We can look at, fossil fuel phase out mandates, all that sort of thing. Shell's not going to suddenly stop emitting as much if it can't buy carbon credits. And so I think, yeah, the sort of emphasis on quality of carbon credits is definitely the most important thing.
Thank you. Now, Peter, for the last question, and yeah, we have around 1.5 minutes, so be happy to.
Yeah, and this can be both for you, Lillian, or Jubin. Jubin, I heard just recently, 7 have been debating about whether or not to put the just transition in the agenda, and mainly that was because the argument was that we don't have even a clearer definition of just transition. So my question is, does that influence whether we are expediting or derailing progress towards realizing this just transition? And then my second question is more taking cue what Sana talked about. The conversation seems ripe for developed countries, but if you come to look at the case of the developing countries where the investment pipeline is still not there, especially knowing that most of the developing countries are dealing with adaptation, things like venture capital, they're not very much robustly developed. Again, the risking guarantees, not so many governments would want to do that because again, they're also depending on aid and things like that. So how do we bring the conversation to in such a multilateral space that both developing and developing countries could speak from the same script, understanding the unique challenges of the.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think lots of these policies are obviously they're more developed in developed countries, but I think something like sovereign issuance, green bond markets, they are growing in emerging markets, and it's those sorts of policies, I think, where you can also look to unlock local investment. These countries might not have, they're often limited with, low sovereign credit ratings, all these sorts of problems. But they will, have often got local pension funds, which we can look to try and get that sort of local investor to participate. I think in try and get them into investments, and then obviously, like you said, government's not very willing to provide guarantees, all that sort of thing. And then that's where we need the roles of MDBs, DFIs to really sort of step up. And I think there's been probably seen there's been a lot of arguments for MDBs to increase their sort of risk taking and risk appetite, which is very challenging thing, which I'm currently writing another paper on. But it's, I think, probably directing the use of concessional capital more to really those sort of very, very high impact areas. And then also in terms of what sort of developed markets can do for developing is that piece on sort of capacity building, helping unlock kind of own government's capabilities to start implementing sort of policies and start sort of addressing transition. I think I missed your first half of your question. Sorry, I can't remember what it was.
Yeah, the last question, I think it was more directed to Gibbon, considering like the status of the multilateral agreements and the consensus on parties that have been slow on defining just transition, even though I think there was already like maybe Gibbon, you can give some of your thoughts on the status on this regard and how does this connect to the government policies then.
Yeah, I mean, I think defining the JT is sort of an issue that's left up to the multilateral system, not to individual countries. But of course, that has to be translated into local context as to what the social disparities at play are. And so I think in a lot of cases, the EMDs have a bit of ways to go when it comes to capacity building domestically, as in they don't understand how best to engage with the MDBs or the DFIs. And that is a key part of what the Green Climate Fund is doing when it comes to the readiness program, the Readiness and Preparatory Support Program, or PSP. And I think when it comes to the point Lillian made about risk-taking and the part of MDBs and DFIs, I think also hugely important, and one that many institutions have found hard to calibrate at a proper level. When you look at what the GCF is doing, the bulk of their money is going into, as you might imagine, mitigation projects like solar and wind, which are well and good. These are, very low risk, very scalable projects that are objectively a good thing for many African economies or developing economies. At the same time, these are the sort of things that private investors will be financing anyway. These are often quite, profitable, and they have guaranteed power purchase agreements, which provide them with a very secure infrastructure investment style cash flow. So there is, you could ask the question: is there a point the World Bank or DFIs coming into, African countries with huge solar endowments and financing this sort of thing when you'd have the private sector doing it anyway? And so you could argue that the additional impact of the World Bank system is limited when it comes to these projects. So they should be taking on more risk, providing, for example, like credit guarantees. I think that's a really, really big one that they should be doing more of, because that is multiplicative capital, not necessarily just additive. And these are the sort of things that free up cap space in the balance sheets of both the MDBs as well as the private institutions that are financing these high risk projects. But on the other extreme, if you have, your World Banks or your GCFs financing venture capital accelerators, that is probably a bit of a lower priority, as Lee mentioned, because the point isn't to develop, like startups from scratch. The point is we know what works when it comes to mitigation. The point is to scale these up as quickly as we can at a rate that is affordable for developing economies. So it's a huge spectrum of what, where money could be spent and how. And I think finding the right balance there is a matter for each country to do within the framework of an agreed global definition of what the JT should entail at a normative level.
We have our next speaker also wants to make an intervention around this regard.
Not intervention, but I just wanted to, we have two wonderful experts, and I just wanted to ask a question. It relates to this, some, as Peter mentioned, there is no single definition of what just transition is. And Gibbs and I also agree that you have to analyze the context specific and context needs, right? So I have a question for you guys, like, is it a matter of each of those countries analyze their context needs, quantify those needs, and then maybe pushing for more, bilateral, or not bilateral, but more, how do you say, not a multilateral partnership, like just energy transition partnership, that happened between Africa and. Actually, I also have this question: is the just energy transition partnership is a good practice? We can consider it as a good practices or not? And if this is a way to go to try to attend those specific needs of just transition of the developing countries,
I can quickly answer on JETP. I think the challenge with that is it was the amounts given were not driven by the investment need, but by what donor governments were willing to donate or lend, which is inherently not going to be ideal. And a large majority of the funds were provided as loans. So that again, that increases the indebtedness issue. So I think that means it's not an ideal model. And of course, we've seen subsequent problems with actual like implementation, speed of action. I mean, we definitely do need that sort of limited financing modeling models for addressing, phase out of fossil fuel assets is really important, and they're sort of trying to embed just transition in that. But I think, yeah, more work needed.
Great. Well, if there's no any questions or interventions, I'll like to thank Lily, Birch, and Gibbon for answering these questions and amazing presentations so far. And I'll like to give the floor to Yusuke now. Yusuke is one of the co-contact points of the Just Transition Working Group, formerly called the Green Jobs Working Group of Youngo. And he's gonna talk about what are we doing in the terms of participating as observers of the negotiations of the Just Transition Work Program. So the floor is yours, Yusuke.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you so much, Lily and Given. Like I was listening, and there's always something like new and interesting to learn. And today I'm here as a invited speaker and as a co-contact point of the Just Transition Working Group. And I want to share with you the perspective from a youth advocate. So I guess you guys could heard about like scientific background of Gil and professional background of Lily, and now it's time to listen to the humble words of the youth advocate in the UNFCCC process. So in today's mission of trying to share understandings of the finance and just transition, and also take into consideration the goal of this finance academy about preparing future climate practitioners, you guys, the participants, to engage on the UNFCCC process. I thought about 4 goals to briefly talk today. So first is to this kind of general understanding of what just transition is. And after, let's take a look on the overall process of what's going on in the just transition discussion inside the UNFCCC. I know that you guys are finance persons, so I imagine that you guys follow a lot of finance discussion in UNFCCC. And now I'm here to present a bit about just transition, how this work stream is going on. And then talks a little bit about tensions and roads to COP29, and also what is the young position. And finally, share with you lots of useful documents and platforms. And that's why I have multiple tabs open here. So I hope that this could be helpful on your way to prepare to COP29. So let's get started. So as Peter already gave us, I'm gonna place my microphone like this. I hope that you can listen. And if you can't, please open the microphone and say, I couldn't hear, so I can go back. So as Peter mentioned, and he gave already a lesson to us, there is no single definition of what just transition is. And could be one of the biggest difficulty in a global context too. And matter of fact, the Just Transition Work Program also, they decided not to discuss the concept of the just transition. So I think this is due to exactly what all of us were talking since now. So I'm not going to be repetitive, because each country has their very different geographical needs and scalabilities and timeframes and context that are different, right? And also even the concept of justice, there is no common understanding across communities. And but it's true that the one thing is true, that this is just transition and needs to encompass this diverse priorities of different communities, and also that range from the mitigation efforts till that adaptation needs. And this non-defined concept of justice can also be understood as an opportunity to englobe and have a more holistic view of what just is, coming from the justice in terms of distribution and distributive justice, or procedural justice in terms of participation, or regenerative justice, and so on and so on. And in this, when you in this context of climate change and needs to address this systemic, system, there are this thing. Actually, I also forgot to mention today was supposed to be me and Jody. Jody is another wonderful person. So yeah, just to mention that she also is contributing directly on this presentation. And Jody was saying there's a two spectrum of change, and this is very interesting. She was speaking about one of the way to face the change from the more status quo and managerial reform. Those are the actions that you propose: corporate driven, market based, based on volunteer initiative to on climate positive change, like for example, like a CSR or ESG initiative, but it's voluntary needs. Those are the most like status quo kind of in the spectrum. And from the other side of the spectrum, you have also the structural reform, the transformative change that gonna talks more about the power relations and existing system of oppression and how to change it, to face it as a transformative way. And this transformative change is interesting because when we talk about just transition, we want to go beyond the simply aiming the change of the economic system to a low carbon emission. We wanted to make a future that is low carbon, but also more sustainable, but not just in the environmental sustainability terms, but a sustainability as a value that englobes the social justice, the fairness. So how we can build a more equitable world. And that's why climate and SDG, they have to be worked together, as shows there's the recent report about climate and SDG synergy that talks about you cannot make this just transition happen without taking into consideration the poverty eradication, the address the inequality of the world, and do this process in a with the fair burden sharing. Who has to take more responsibility and more leadership in to this transitioning phase? And for this matter, we always have to remember what the Framework Convention talks about, how developed countries must take lead. Oh no, actually the right wording is should take lead on the, I don't remember where is the paragraph, but also this is same for the Paris Agreement. This also mentions, and it's even the Paris Agreement also recognizes this idea of facing the climate change in the context of sustainability, development and eradication of the poverty. But anyway, let's go back to the. Oh, it's not here. Yes, it's here. All right. Being said that, we also have the definition to make it more concrete of the ILO. I guess this is a good definition. It talks about greening the economy. So the just transition is greening the economy in a way that is fair and inclusive as possible, creating decent jobs, opportunity, and leaving no one behind. So in this sentence, you can see this idea of a lower emission, a fair social structure for the sustainable future, and also the decent work, because we have to remember that the just transition movement started in the trade unions in the 1780s, that gives transform in that along the way it's starting to be taken by other climate activist groups, and then emerged this term climate justice, that actually is a principle that comes from the pressure of the social movement. This was a lot of our gain, let's say, in the UNFCCC process, although justice is still not considered in multiple work stream inside the UN. And also, when we say no one leave no one behind is about justice to the society most affected in this process of transition. So those were the general concepts of what just transition is. I guess there are a lot of discussion, and if you want, you can also always join our working group to discuss too. And now I really wanted to go to the outcomes of the SP60, what happened over there, and attention and roads to COP29. So to understand the XP60 that happened in 2024, we have also to understand the context of the Just Transition Work Program. So this work stream inside the UNFCCC was relatively new. So it appears on the decision of Egypt that says that we need to establish a work program to address the just transition as a pathway to achieve the Paris Agreement goals, right? And on the Paris Agreement goals, you have the mention of just transition. Opa, this is not the just transition one. So here you can see this is the article that refers to, actually it's not an article, it's a preamble, taking account the imperative of just transition of the workforce. In the Paris Agreement, there's the reference to the workforce, okay? But this will change as you're gonna see. But anyway, so in UAE last year, they established a work program, and also they established what will be discussed in the work plan. So this is very interesting thing to take. So if you wanted to understand more about how to frame just transition inside the UNFCCC, take a look on the decision of the UAE on the page 13. I'm gonna share all the documents with you. So here, because here, although the just transition is abroad, and as we discussed, they put a list of elements that they would take into consideration. So by just transition, they are talking about energy transition, socioeconomic aspect, workforce, and other dimensions. So we have a wording that opens a possibility to include other elements. We also have the challenge and to address the challenge and barriers for sustainable development, poverty eradication. This is very good. Also enhanced adaptation and climate resiliency efforts, and also workforce and creation of decent jobs, and also participatory approaches, and finally, international cooperation to enable this just transition. So this paragraph 2 of the 3 CMA 5, it's very important to you to have in mind to understand how you can frame just transition inside the UNFCCC discussion. But remembering always that just transition, those elements doesn't define the just transition, can be gone beyond. And what was the action that they decided to take? They decided to take 2 dialogues per year to share practices and do more deeper discussions. So countries basically they decided to have 2 discussions, dialogues, intensive dialogues to share good practices till 2026, when this work program will be reviewed and decided whether to continue or not. And to guide all this process, each session, they prepared a contact group to organize how we're going to set this program, when we're going to send the dialogues, and what we're going to be discussing. So actually in the 2024, this June, when happened the first dialogue, and you can also find a report about the first dialogue here, and what they discussed, but basically how to incorporate the just transition in the national communication tools, and namely NDCs, NAPs, and LT-LEDs. So this was discussed, and they were talking about, what were the barriers and etc. And on the contact group level, and the substantial negotiation process, they were discussing more the operational stuff. So it wasn't that funny actually, because they weren't discussing the substance of it. They were more about like, how we can better include the observers, how we can decide on the topic of the second dialogue, when we're going to make it. So those were the discussion. And also, but we also had the more substance discussion on the just transition, about elaborating or not a work plan. And this what is a work plan? Work plan, is a one-off strategy in order to provide more concrete actions to the countries to do so. So dialogue is more the discussing. Work plan will be something that will bring actionable solutions. This was proposed by G77 in China, but was blocked by the US and some developed countries. And at the end of the SP60, we were worried because there were no draft decision to be sent to the COP29 to be adopted. They had an informal note. And what is an informal note? Informal note is just, let's say, we have a discussion here, and we're going to put our idea on an informal note. And on the next time, it's like a meeting minute that we're going to take the meeting minute into consideration to keep the discussion. So this was it. That's a very weak outcome, very low from what we were expected. Very sad. And now we are heading to COP29, and what will happen next? So we're going to have the second dialogue on Egypt. So they're going to talk about this ensuring support to people-centric and equitable just transition pathways with a focus on whole society approach the workforce and the workforce. So this will be the second dialogue topic. And unfortunately, it's a closed dialogue session. Some of our working groups member will be participating there in person and virtually. And also we're going to have the SB 61 to continue the previous discussion, take into consideration the meeting minute and elaborate a possible draft decision to be adopted in COP29. And what are the difficulties? What are the challenges on this this discussion? We map to you two. So first is about the work plan. Are we going to have a work plan or not? And if you see on the informal meeting, you're going to find it very interesting. So if you're preparing for a negotiation process for the just transition or to the SB, so the COP29 that will happen, the SB 61, please take into consideration the informal note. And here you're going to see some placeholders. For example, guidance on ensuring a dialogue on conducting concrete outcomes, and actionable solutions. They also have a placeholder on work plan. Placeholder is basically saying that work plan idea was proposed, but they are contentious. They need consensus to be, placed without a placeholder. This means that they will have this discussion. But of course, Global North, there's a lot of discussion on that, mainly because this is the kind of the reason behind what the international cooperation looks like, because everybody agrees on international cooperation. However, Global North understand that in the Just Transition Work Program, international cooperation is dialogue, share best practices, and that's it. And the Global South, they are calling for more concrete coordination efforts, namely the finance and the conditions to the just transition. So, basically, Global South is asking for means of implementation, capacity building, technology transfer, and Global North is more like, let's now everybody do their part. We can exchange information, but let's hold on to it. So this is the most big attention that we have on the room. And what are the what we can try to aim for? First of all, what we can aim for is to hold accountability of parties to respect the paragraph 2 of the so it's the first document, because although they agreed on this in this second paragraph, as it's not like as the negotiation is party driven. If the parties doesn't want to take this into consideration, they can. So it's always good to hold them accountable and ask when we're going to talk about adaptation, climate resiliency, where these elements are, and etc. Because this still is not exhaustive, but it's a very comprehensive way to understand a just transition that before in the Paris Agreement was just a workforce, but nowadays are this set of big lists. And another thing is to how we can ensure that the result of the dialogues, okay, they're going to dialogue about the whole society approach, but how this will turn into actionable solutions. This is an interesting question. Maybe through a work plan, or maybe through some sort of more more stronger formats. I don't know, but to try to find a way, to translate this dialogue into concrete actions, and then monitor the topic of the dialogue, because we're gonna have the second dialogue, and also the moment of the dialogue. It's also important where observants can share their views on it. So those are the thing. And if you want to see more, and if you are interested on what the countries are saying, this platform, the submission portal, I guess you are familiar already, but this is an interesting way to find it. So just transition, you put just transition here and take a look. And those are so we have the second dialogue. So you can click what the countries are saying. So let's take a quick look on what some countries are saying that is interesting too. So, for example, for the SIDS, for the small island developing states, they are very talking about their capability on adaptation and climate resiliency, and calling that this is the most important aspect of the just transition that we need to achieve, and also includes finance on adaptation and climate resiliency part. For example, when you take the LDC, the least developed countries, you can take a look on their submission, and you're gonna find, where was it? So sorry, I will have to go back to the notes. Yeah, they say the precarious present make it difficult to prepare preparation for any future. So this actually relates to the intergenerational justice idea of how we can set a more favorable space to develop an economic system, to develop urban system, agricultural system that is compatible compatible with the climate boundaries, in a way to achieve this just transition. And also, if you take, and there's the last one, the EU submission, it's interesting how they talk about the access to essential services, namely on this just transition. We have to take into consideration the age, gender, the vulnerability, understand the vulnerability, and give access to affordable housing, transport, food, energy, etc. But ironically, this is for the EU states, right? Member state citizens. And ironically, when it comes to the relation between EU and other countries, there are still those difficulties of loans, non-grants, and non-concessional financings that prevent the developing countries to provide their essential services to their people. So it's also a discussable, could be a discussable topic. So those are the interesting views that you can be checking on the portal of the submission. And also let me also say, if you wanna have summaries of the SPs, this is the website of the very interesting website of the International Institution for Sustainable Development. And if you just look for just transition, there are everything that you have to know. A summary of what was discussed during SP, for example, here. So they have what are the key areas, very complete summary, I would say. So this website is also very highly recommended. So this IISD, this is always good. Anyway, lastly, let's go to what we Yongo is saying and talking about in this whole process of just transition. And we are trying to focus on those four in a substance of what just transition is more about just four areas of it. So we first defending the more broader understanding of just transition. And this is interesting because it sounds obvious, but actually it's not. If you take, for example, trade union observers, of course, they're trade unions, so they will have more narrowed understanding of just transition. Or if you take developed countries' position, usually they have more narrowed just transition also understanding. For example, EU even use the term green transition and not just transition. So this is interesting to see. So we are more into broad. The second aspect is to take the holistic understanding of what just is, right? And to understand that the relation between intergenerational justice and finance, there is also a very interesting report from the Coalition of Youth. I guess I will take the report later. But yeah, so this is very it's important, and it's something that is not climate justice is still not there in the decisions, but something that we should take into push for. Third, we have this idea of education, training, retooling. So it's really about education for sustainability, green entrepreneurism, green skills, and finally the economic transformation, you know. And it sounds like lots of random words, and just wanted to, you know, to share with you the discussion, for example, that we had with Jody at once. We were talking about distributive justice, this idea of we're going to create wealth and distribute wealth. And Jody was saying, but why cannot we create a system then, you know, transform a system in a way that you don't need a distribution mechanism later? Why we cannot create aim a society where there are shared opportunities, uh, and where, you know, respecting their self-determination and respecting the right to sustainable development. So we don't need a distributive mechanism later. I guess this is the way to address distributive justice, but in the core and not later. And when you think in this discussion inside the context of green economy, for example, then we're going to talk about how about like pushing green entrepreneurism in African continent. And it's interesting because there are a lot of challenges. While in the EU, you have lots of instruments in a Green New Deal that allows a space for SMEs, you know, to transform their businesses into green one, and more accessibility to green jobs creation. And still in Africa, there's a difficulty to it. And also, once I was talking to an African youth, and he was talking to me that entrepreneurism for him, and he was from Nigeria, he said, it's not a matter of opportunity, it's a matter of necessity. So, I mean, it's even far, kind of bit far from his, because he was talking for the African youth about like what green entrepreneurism is. But this it leads to another worry about like, what about, because if you transform the economic system, greener economic system, but still those countries will be kind of behind on the competition for a green this green market in this green. So how we can provide opportunities and, you know, educations and training and retooling, mainly for the vulnerable groups, mainly for the groups that they have a potential to be left behind. So those are the discussions around youth. And when we talk about intergenerational justice, long story short, we can talk about this idea of loans and debts. Debts will be paid for future generations. So you can use the narrative of international justice to fundament the debts cancellation, for example. So this is kind of the arguments that you can be using. So, I mean, I imagine that there were a lot of information. I'm going to stop here. But you're more than welcome to be, you know, those are the forms, I guess. I don't know. Can I put it here, Jen? I mean, after I will send this document, I'm going to put all the links, interesting links, and I will send it to you, Jen, again, and you can share with the people, I guess.
Yeah,
Right.
thank you so much, Yusuke. Yeah, we will definitely going to be sharing this document or a copy of this document in our folder where all our resources are for the cohort applicants to access, well, and anyone else as well from the younger white community. So super happy. I'm interested to know if there's any questions so far regarding the negotiations or so on. Yes, will there be an attendance sheet? Yes, I will share it right now for people to join.
Yeah.
We have like some time left. We don't have any other speakers, so we highly encourage to ask questions and comments so far. And we can allocate a little bit of time at the end as well to kind of get your feedback so far on how you're feeling in the Climate Finance Academy, and how can we help how can you help us improve so we can help you back engage in how can we engage in these younger discussions? Maybe you can answer that, Usuke.
Sorry.
There was a question in the chat surrounding how do we engage in this Youngo discussion. So all of these things that you're talking about have been on position building. Where do they take place?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I guess you can also. But this is the link that you referred to. You said on being part of the Yongo discussion. So first of all, fill the form to go inside Yongo. Yongo functions in 28 thematic working groups. So those thematic working groups follows those specific thematic negotiation inside the UNFCCC. So you're gonna find action for climate empowerment. If you're more into water and climate, there are water climate working groups, finance and market, as you as Janara is from, or just if you're interested in just transition, you're gonna come to the just transition working group. Inside the just transition working group, we do this this very bureaucratic thing of analyzing what the people from the around the young people from around the world is saying, try to rewrite it, make policy discussions about to respond the questions that was sent from the secretariat, because secretariat often ask observers, what are your thoughts, for example, on including just transition in NDCs, for example? And then we have to make our research, and write a submission paper and submit. This is the way how we advocate. So it's very bureaucratic. It's not activism work, but it's very important. You're representing 2.3 billion of children and youth. You have a high responsibility. It's a volunteer job, but it's a special volunteer job, let's say. Yeah, and I guess that's the question. And then Christian asks if European Union would go out with a pledge on the topic of COP29, and you could phrase it in any way, what would it be? I didn't understood actually, Christian. Can you open a mic?
Yeah.
Christian?
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the discussion so far. So my question is, if they could go out with a pledge on the topic of just transition on the COP29, what would it be? If you could dream really wild and be like, they could come up with anything, what would it be?
What could it be? Jen, you wanna answer also? Because if we can dream together.
Comment a little bit on what has been like my personal engagement in the few days. There has been a lot of engagement from the Green Climate Fund in Chile, like series of workshops so far on like updating us on how is like the negotiations under the GCF going and so on. But I've heard a lot of and understood now that like the financial mechanism is like also set to achieve some of these goals of like protecting the most vulnerable communities and so on, or leaving everyone behind. And now they're taking a much more like whole of society approach in the sense of including specific targets on a small and medium enterprises. And I guess that's where that's where the society could also benefit as well in collaboration with the implementing agencies and the designating focal points for the financial mechanism. Is as we're gonna see more money coming into these funds, and it should be like it should be like duplicate the current amount of money that is on the financial mechanism, namely the GCF primarily. I think it's very important that we highlight this position on aligning the just transition work with the financial mechanism in a way that we can align us as well of the efforts on the meaning of the means of implementation because this is such a like such a big change like such a big like potential of unlocking change on the ground and understanding how our world is going with the rapid transformation of technology through AI and the green transition and so on. A lot of the skills are going to be outdated for the current workforce, so we're going to see like higher percentage of unemployment, and that means that those companies needs to have the enough funds to transform themselves, but also to train that new set of employees to don't have them lose their jobs in a context of highly more skilled jobs. And I guess that's one of the things that the EU also should have a role in. And it's like as they are one of the economies that have the most like skilled workforce. They should also be willing to support developing countries in the means of implementation surrounding capacity building, but not just for the governments, but also to have wider accessibility of green job skill training for especially for small medium enterprises that suffer that are very vulnerable as they suffer a higher cost of capital. They have fewer financial stability and so on, and it will be affected by changes in prices. They will be affected by changes in monetary policies from countries as we all trying to address climate change. So yeah, very broad and trying to link it with the financial financial aspect. But yeah, I hope that that helps to drive some kind of like answer to that. And that's like my personal opinion, and of course it's biased because I've been engaging a lot with the Chilean. But yeah.
For sure. And just to complement that information, there are certain more specific numbers. And of course, those numbers are from reports. But if you have this is London School of Economics and stuff, and it gives this number of their minimum need of 85 billion annually to finance just transition activities to affected communities and workers. So, and I guess that would be the numbers, or there are others here too. But like I just want, I guess it's also like really if we could do whatever we want, aim big, aim to go wider. I would also say like, concession law and this idea of like providing supports are fundamental in order to them to develop. But what to do, I guess in an ideal world, I guess I would say how we can develop, equally and those developing and least developed countries, respecting their self-determination, respecting their right to the self-development, so they can, develop in a way, their own way, compatible with the planetary climate system, and have this shared opportunity, I don't know, like well, and I'll have Jenny, can we do a question for the audience? If we could have enough money to support developing countries to just transit, where you guys put this money on?
Interesting question.
To achieve the just transition? What would you do if we said we are a big fund and I will say, I'll give you every money that you need to do to just transition? What would be the three, let's make it easier, three policy for just transition where you would allocate the money on your country? So you could
all we hear from China.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I wanna comment. If no one else wants to raise their hand, then I highly encourage. I think that from my personal experience and like working with cooperatives on ground, mainly on agroecology, but now thinking of like the just energy transition and the fact that just energy should be achievable by all, especially vulnerable communities and so on. As we make these big policy changes that are needed, for example, reducing the subsidies on fossil fuels in the energy sector that will also drive the prices and lower the amount of supply of energy that will be reaching this community. So this is like crucial that we do also policies to contrast this effect and focusing on skill development for developing local energy cooperatives in a way that they could have more sovereignty on the generation of the energy they need to sustain their communities and profiting on the fact that the new energy technologies are developing at a pace that if they count with the enough money, then there's a way that we can provide the enough infrastructure for local communities to develop these energy cooperatives and supply for the need of their communities. But that's just like on one side. But of course, there's if I can come back to the Chilean like perspectives, we have like this definition, and every country does, but it's like on the socio-ecological just transition, which is more like a whole of like ecosystem approach when regarding just transitions, because especially on the global south, you can see that there's a lot of like territories that are highly affected by many pollutants and damage to nature. And as we're trying to account for what nature and of course there's this weird way of like putting it on um sorry on uh, putting a money value on nature. And I know it sounds weird, but it's a way that we can then contrast and see like, oh, there's some investment that might look profitable for the private sector and the economy. But then you take a look at how much it costs. It's costing nature, and then it doesn't turn profitable anymore. So as a way of taking that approach of incentivizing those investments that are have have a less cost or benefit to nature, and then fund nature-based solutions that they can then you can transform these polluting activities in highly concentrated areas. So it's actually in our country, they're called sacrifice zones, because there are territories that are so industrialized that literally like people get cancer or people cannot live their life because they cannot breathe a healthy air to exist. So it's important that we also consider it like nature as part of the of an aspect on the just transition. Sorry that I went
Perfect.
on, but if anyone else.
Yeah. And also, I don't know, this is going to be my last intervention. If you're interested on trying to see what would be the policy toward just transition in the national level, I highly recommend you to take a look on the ILO guideline for just transition that was published in 2025, 2015. So they already have this thing like discussed. ILO have been discussed this for a long time already. So so it's interesting to see how you can go after just transition UN documents outside the UNFCCC. This UNFCCC is one of the bodies that discuss just transition, but there are other multiple UN agencies that also discuss and that have very interesting documents. So one of them is this. So that's it. And Jen, someone said, asked, yes, exactly. Thank you so much.
Find all the links that are if you lose that link, it's always in our Instagram page. And yeah, I think we've shared it also in the WhatsApp group, so you can find it there. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Isuke. I don't know if there's any further questions from our audience. If not, I will also want to ask our colleagues here is about the feedback on the Climate Finance Academy right so far, and how can we like improve, and considering that there's about a month and less than a month and a half from COP. So we want to make sure that the next workshops, and next week is super busy. We're gonna have a workshop on Tuesday and a session on Wednesday. So you should. Oh, I think I haven't yet, but I will add you to the calendar as well, so you can have it. So yeah, thank you very much for participating. I'll close the recording now, but we can take notes.
Sure.
Yusuke, wanna say
I
something?
will share the document that I elaborated today on the chat already, but I remembering that I will update it with putting the links that I presented today. So this is the doc. So those people that wants to have it, have it. But remember that I will still put the links. That's it.